and economic Thank you. Analyst for Earn in the South at the Economic Policy Institute. Our session today will present 4 new papers to increase our understanding of the extent of workplace sexual harassment, the costs for workers, and ways to limit it. Across the papers today, our presenters will highlight commonalities in the circumstances leading to harassment, identify the failure of both organizational practices and the legal system to provide effective solutions, highlight short and long-term financial costs to survivors of workplace harassment, examine the nature and extent in low-wage retail and janitorial jobs, and discuss the role that supervisory and peer behavior and collective organizing of workers can help play in mitigating those costs. Our panelists today are Jennifer Mondino. She's the director of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund at the National Women's Law Center. We have Jessica Forden, an economics graduate student at the New School for Social Research and a research associate at the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, where she is studying gender, labor, and the older workforce. We have Eve Mefford, a researcher at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. She is working on issues related to economic justice and labor across race, class, and gender. We have Sanjay Pinto, a fellow at the Worker Institute at Cornell and the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. We have Casey Wagner, the director of the Equity at Work Initiative at the Worker Institute at Cornell ILR. And we have Zoe West, an anthropologist and oral historian whose work centers on labor organizing, low-wage work, and migration. As they are presenting their research, if you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the chat. We will keep track of the questions in the chat and we will answer them after everyone has given their presentations. We have reserved 20 minutes at the end for Q&A, so we will have plenty of time for that. So now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Jennifer Mondino to present Coming Forward, Key Trends and Data from the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, thank you so much to the LIRA conference organizers and to my esteemed co-panelists, especially Eve and Ariane at the Institute for Women's Policy Research for organizing this panel and supporting this panel and inviting me to share a little with you today about the work of the National Women's Law Center and the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. It is my honor to be in community with all of you today. So as Chandra mentioned, I'm currently director of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. I'm also part of the original staff of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. So that means that I have been working with the fund almost since its creation in January 2018. And in that role, I have had a unique vantage point to get to hear from individuals all across the country who are seeking help with situations involving sex discrimination, including sex harassment in the workplace. So with that in mind, in October 2020, I co-authored, together with Jasmine Tucker, who's Director of Research at the National Women's Law Center, a report based on an analysis of the thousands of requests for legal help that we had received since the launch of the fund in January 2018. And I'd like to share with you all today some of the starkest findings from that analysis. If I have time, I'll get into a little bit about how we translate that into a call for action for employers, but I want to make sure I leave time for my co-panelists. This is by necessity going to be a quick and high-level overview, but I'm very happy to answer questions after everyone has spoken or to connect with folks after today. So before I get to the report, though, let me take a step back and give you all some quick background on the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and the Legal Network for Gender Equity, who we are and what we do. Can you go to the next slide, please? Here you have our logos. Can you go to the next one? So there are 4 major components to what we do with the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. First of all, we connect workers with legal help. Second of all, we fund legal matters involving workplace sex harassment and related retaliation. Third, we provide media and storytelling assistance for situations that involve workplace sex harassment and related retaliation. And fourth, we have funded community outreach and education about workplace sex harassment. And I'll tell you about each of these briefly in turn. Next slide. So connecting workers, basically what we do is we connect individuals who have experienced sex discrimination, including sexual harassment, in 3 areas: in the workplace, in education, and in healthcare, with legal help. Basically what we are connecting them to attorneys for is to have a free initial legal consultation. And the attorneys that we're connecting them with are attorneys who are in our network. We call it the Legal Network for Gender Equity. And these are folks who have agreed to give free initial legal consultations and basically share their expertise and time to help join with us to fight workplace sex harassment. Next slide. Since January 2018, we have responded to more than 7,600 requests for legal help, and more than 5,800 of those requests have involved workplace sex harassment. So it's an incredibly large number of requests we've gotten from across the country. The focus of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is on supporting low-paid workers. We hear from all kinds of folks, but that is our focus. So we, keep close tabs on the demographics and income levels of the folks that are coming to us, and have noted that nearly 3/4 of the people who have come to us seeking legal help self-identify as low income. Also, more than 1/3 of the people who have come to us identify as women of color. Next slide. Like I said, we also provide funding for legal matters that involve workplace sex harassment and related retaliation. This slide is a little bit about the process. It's a competitive process. Next slide, please. This is a little bit about the kinds of cases that we have funded. Since March 2018, we have funded over 320 legal matters, and there are different types of cases that we are particularly enthusiastic about supporting. One of them, like I mentioned before, is cases involving low-paid workers, but there are other types of cases that we are especially committed to supporting also. Next slide. We also provide storytelling and media assistance for situations involving workplace sex harassment and related retaliation. And this comes up for a number of reasons. Sometimes people that come to us don't want to file a lawsuit, but they do want to find another way to tell their story about what they've experienced. Sometimes people are dealing with inquiries from the press, or maybe they're even facing backlash in the press because of having spoken out about workplace sex harassment. So we connect those people to public relations professionals that are in our network and cover the costs of them working with those public relations professionals, and give them guidance about how to tell their story, how to connect to media outlets, and deal with those situations. And since the outset of the fund, we have provided this kind of assistance to more than 125 individuals. Next slide. Last but not least, I mentioned that we had funded some community outreach and education. We funded these 18 worker-focused, community-based organizations. They are a phenomenal group of organizations, and they have different focuses. They work with different populations. For example, farm workers, restaurant workers, nail salon workers, and recent immigrants are some of the groups. Next slide. Okay, so I will tell you a little bit about this report that I co-authored. Basically, we did, together with my director of research, we did an analysis of more than 3,000 workplace sex harassment requests for legal help that had been received by the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund between January 2018 and April 2020. And the purpose of that analysis was to see what those requests for legal help revealed about the dynamics of workplace sex harassment, trends of workplace sex harassment, what was happening with people that, put them in a position to want to reach out for legal help. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the most striking findings. The first one was about the prevalence of retaliation. More than 7 in 10 people that reached out to us for legal help had experienced some form of retaliation. This is, I think, a really startling number. And you all may know, retaliation can take many forms, some subtle, some not so subtle. We hear from, for example, contract workers being told there's no more work for them, restaurant and retail workers being assigned fewer shifts, individuals who are up for promotion, finding that that promotion is no longer on offer. Those are just a few examples. Of the people that told us about retaliation, the most common form that they mentioned was being fired. 36% of the people who reported experiencing retaliation reported having been fired outright. We also heard about other really severe forms of retaliation. More than 1 in 7 people who reported retaliation said that they were threatened with legal action, threatened with losing their job, or even threatened with physical harm as a result of having spoken out about workplace sex harassment. Next slide, please. Another really striking part of our findings was about the enduring impacts of workplace sex harassment. I think, people know about what it might be like to be experiencing workplace sex harassment, but it was striking to us to hear about how much of a long-term impact it could have on people's lives in terms of their economic and financial well-being and their mental health. We heard from more than 1 in 5 people that workplace sex harassment had a negative impact on their economic or financial well-being. And nearly 1/4 of those people said that it meant that they weren't able to find another job. So after they had been in their workplace sex harassment situation, they were unable to find a new job. And, imagine all of the repercussions of that. The mental health consequences were just as striking. Nearly 1 in 5 people shared with us that the sex harassment had had long-term negative repercussions for their mental health. Next slide. We were also very struck by the severity of the workplace sex harassment that people described to us. I think this is something that, to me, counters some of the stereotypes that are out there about workplace sex harassment and the Me Too movement. Sometimes, we hear about people thinking that it's just people not being able to take a joke, or this is, misinterpreting comments in the workplace. But we heard from more than 1/3 of the people that reached out to us that the workplace harassment that they had experienced included physical harassment, sexual assault, or rape. So really severe forms of harassment that they were experiencing. Another thing that we heard that was striking, and I think is also sort of a myth-busting trend, is that workers were relying on their employers. Workers were turning to their employers, but then ultimately being let down by their employers. I think sometimes we hear from employers this idea, how were they supposed to know that this was going on? Like, it is bad, but we didn't know. But the people that came to us, nearly 2 in 3 of the people that came to us seeking legal help and said that they had reported their sex harassment, had reported it to their employers. So this is people going in the first instance to their employers for help. But then after they had gone to their employers were not holding the harassers accountable. We heard from nearly 3 in 10 workers that after they had told their employers about the workplace sex harassment, nothing happened. The employers did absolutely nothing at all. And this was despite the fact that the harassment that people were telling us about was happening at really high levels. We heard from more than half of the people who identified their harasser to us said that they had been harassed by somebody who was in a position of power over them. So supervisors, managers, other leadership at work. So this is harassment that's coming from above, coming from the top. Together with that, more than 1 in 5 people who identified their harasser said that their harasser had been harassing multiple people at work. So I think that really points to what a threat to safety this is in the workplace, right? You have people reporting harassment, and the harassment is coming from above, and the harassment is putting not just the individual, but many people at risk of harm. Next slide, please.
And you have 1 minute.
Okay. I think that my next couple of slides were meant to pull out a bit about what this means for employers. So if you could just go to the next slide, I'll scroll through them just to let you all know that the National Women's Law Center has taken a lot of these trends and paired them together with research that we have gotten from social scientists, from advocates that we work with, and tried to turn it into advice for employers about how to prevent harassment and how to respond to harassment when it occurs. So some of those things are making sure to include workers in coming up with your plans and taking a survivor-centered approach, also being transparent about what you are doing, and having multiple channels for reporting harassment. I don't see the slides advancing. Can you move to the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so here you have just some bullet points. Next slide, please. Effective regular training, tracking and monitoring. And then on this next slide, if you could go to the next one, here are the names of some of the reports and a link to one of them that we have on the National Women's Law Center website, where we are pulling out the trends that I'm talking about in our analysis, paired with recommendations for employers. So I would commend you to take a look at those. One of the beauties of having the Times Up Legal Defense Fund in the National Women's Law Center is that I work with these terrific colleagues who come out with reports like this one. Next slide, please. Here's my contact information. Like I said, I'm really happy to answer questions later today or also to connect with folks at a later time. And I will leave it there to make sure to leave time for my co-panelists. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. That was very informative. So next up, we have Jess Forden and Eve Mefford presenting Paying Today and Tomorrow, Charting the Financial Costs of Workplace Sexual Harassment. And just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to them at the end. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Jess and Eve now.
Thank you so much, Chandra. And thank you to everybody attending our panel, our fellow panelists, and Ariane and Eve especially for helping to organize us today. So Eve and I will be sharing some research we conducted last year at the Institute for Women's Policy Research and Time's Up on the economic costs of workplace sexual harassment. Next slide, please. So to start, we want to give a sense of what motivated this work. There is quite a lot of literature on the negative health and general effects of workplace sexual harassment to individuals, as well as research quantifying the economic costs of workplace sexual harassment to businesses and employers specifically. However, with the exception of Heather McLaughlin's excellent research on the career effects of workplace sexual harassment, we struggled to find research as to the financial costs of workplace sexual harassment to individuals over their lifetime. So this work was really intended to begin a process to help fill that gap. Next slide. For this project, we decided to take a mixed methods approach using both qualitative and quantitative components. To begin, we conducted 16 in-depth interviews with individuals who had experienced workplace sexual harassment in the past, focusing more on individuals in lower paying occupations. Importantly, there's obviously harassment in higher paying, managerial, and professional occupations as well. But we felt that their stories had arguably been better documented, as they're more likely to be able to seek legal recourse. And so we really wanted to focus more on individuals in sectors where they may have had less of a voice in sharing their stories to date. In the interviews that we conducted, we asked questions regarding these individuals' experiences with sexual harassment, what happened, how it affected them. And we also asked questions about how it impacted their employment options and choices, whether they sought any medical treatment or therapy, and how it affected them financially, both immediately and later down the line. We also conducted several expert and stakeholder interviews, including talking to sex discrimination lawyers and occupational economists, researchers, and worker advocates to really contextualize these individual stories within broader themes. Next slide, please. As part of this work, we wanted to make sure that we were laying out a robust mapping of all the different costs workers might incur as a result of an experience of workplace sexual harassment. And so we've landed with 3 categories here, as you can see: the direct costs, what we call knock-on or consequential costs, and then non-summable costs. So direct costs are financial effects that are directly attributable to the harassment or retaliation that may occur as a result of speaking up or making a complaint. This includes costs like lost pay if hours are cut back after a complaint is made, lost earnings if someone is fired or has to leave their job to escape their harasser, and fees for any medical treatment, therapy or medication, et cetera, needed to help treat the trauma of experiencing that harassment. In contrast, knock-on costs or consequential costs are second order effects that may arise as a result of the direct costs of sexual harassment. So for example, this may be when you have reduced earnings or unemployment, it may make it more difficult for you to pay your bills, debts, loans, et cetera, which can lead to higher interest payments, lower credit scores, and increased housing insecurity. In particular, we found that it was really important to include these second order costs in our analysis, as we found that they could be particularly substantial for those who work in lower wage jobs and who are likely to have fewer resources to fall back on if they lose their primary income source. And then lastly, we have this non-summable costs category, which are intangible costs that are not really quantifiable, but that we felt were really important to include, as they really are no less significant to the person who experienced the harassment. Next slide, please.
All right, so in order to exemplify these costs, I'll take you through Denise's story. Denise was an apprentice in the construction trades. She was a union member, which meant that her job had good pay, great benefits, and a pension. Unfortunately, she experienced harassment at the hands of a coworker. It was so severe that it led her to make the really difficult decision to leave her job and for her leave the trades entirely. She was unemployed for 7 months, during which time she was not eligible to receive unemployment benefits because she quit and was not let go. And after those 7 months, she got a job as a non-union bus driver that paid half as much as her previous job, had worse benefits, and no pension. As a result of the severity of the harassment, she also sought medical attention, both physical and emotional treatment to deal with repercussions. Next slide, please. So I'll walk you through our quantitative methodology. Oh, if you could go back one. So the methodology for translating our interview with Denise into lifetime financial costs follows the standard practice used in damages analysis by expert witnesses in legal cases. And if you're interested in that, you can refer to Stevenson et al. And Bendick for some really great overviews. So in our methodology, we compare the hypothetical base scenario where no harassment occurred and her career progressed as she would have expected, which you can see outlined in purple at the top. And we compare that to the actual scenario that I described in the last slide. And that's right below scenario 1. It's boxed around in the pink. So you can see that this huge number, the $1.3 million over her lifetime, is a combination both of those 7 months where she wasn't earning income, as well as this big gap in salary and benefits. So even with the standard 3% annual increase in income that we apply in both scenarios, going until retirement, the lower starting salary in job B, which is that bus driver job, compounds the cost year after year over the course of her lifetime. And that's really where the cost is racked up. You can also see at the bottom, we factor in the additional costs of her medical expenses. And that's how we calculate her lifetime cost. Next slide, please. So there are 3 findings that we want you to take away from this work. The first is that costs were particularly high for those like Denise who are pushed out of well-paid male-dominated occupations like those in the trades. Hand in hand with that is that people who are employed in occupations with lower earnings, often female-dominated service sector jobs or jobs that paid similarly low salaries or hourly wages, the direct financial cost of sexual harassment was lower just as a function of that lower starting salary. However, the consequential and non-summable costs that just described are often much higher. And that's because when they were working with such a low salary, they were prevented from developing a savings or building up a safety net that would have allowed them to have a fallback in the event of these really unfortunate and unforeseen circumstances. So that presented itself with food insecurity, with homelessness, losing a car, having the electricity turned off in their house because they couldn't make payments on their bills. All number of additional costs, which really take an emotional and knock-on financial toll. Finally, in nearly every interview, we found that the policies designed to prevent workplace sexual harassment were not working. The costs of harassment were magnified each time by inaction and retaliation from the very people who were supposed to be supporting these individuals. Supervisors, managers, employers, even unions were not only failing to prevent harassment, but sometimes even participating in retaliation. Next slide, please. So this study is by no means a representative sample. It had a very small sample size, but we would like to present these data as kind of a jumping off point for future research. So through these case studies, we've been able to identify the data points that are needed to look at the lifetime cost of sexual harassment on a national scale. And I list some of these important data points below. Next slide, please. We provide our references here, and I'll post the PowerPoint in the notes in the chat once again. And next slide. You're welcome to contact us if you have any questions. Our emails are here, and thank you so much.
Fantastic. All right, thank you very much, Jess and Eve. And so let's move to our final presentation. Here we have Sanjay Pinto, Casey Wagner, and Zoe West. They'll be presenting two papers. The first one is Neutralizing the Cost of Workplace Sexual Harassment, Results from a National Survey of Retail and Food Service Workers. And the second is Sweeping Change, Building Survivor and Worker Leadership to Confront Sexual Harassment in the Janitorial Industry. And I will go ahead and turn it over to them now.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Chandra. Thanks to Ariane and Eve for organizing this session. It's really good to be a part of this important discussion. So in these last two presentations, we want to keep in mind what our colleagues have said about the conditions that give rise to workplace sexual harassment and violence, and the serious cost for survivors, and also, what happens when people come forward. And we want to present some findings on the difference that supportive colleagues can make, both in navigating the lasting traumas of sexual harassment and helping to change workplace cultures. Phoebe Strom, unfortunately, couldn't be here today. And so I'm going to speak about some work we're doing in collaboration with Kristen Harknett and Danny Schneider, which looks at the impacts of sexual harassment nationally among retail workers. And then Casey Wagner and Zoe West will speak about a case study we did on the janitor promotora model in California. And sorry, you can skip 2 slides ahead. Great, thank you. So as Ariane, Eve, and Jess talk about, there's quite a substantial literature on the costs of sexual harassment, including the financial costs that they show in really excruciating detail. As indicators of career consequences in this research, we look at turnover intent and job satisfaction. And to measure psychological impact, we look at indicators of psychological distress and sleep quality. There's also been some work on how supervisory and coworker relations shape dynamics of harassment in recent work. Drawing on the General Social Survey, Vincent Rasquinho, for example, shows that positive supervisory and coworker relations help to reduce the incidence of sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination. Here we consider whether perceptions of supervisory fairness and coworker support help to moderate the career and psychological impacts of sexual harassment and violence. Of course, eradicating these behaviors is always the ultimate goal, but to the extent that they persist, how can some of their often lasting effects at least be neutralized? So to address these issues, we draw on data from the SHIFT project, which is led by Kristen Harknett and Danny Schneider. As many of you are likely aware, SHIFT gathers data from workers at large retail firms around the country through ongoing surveys, and it addresses scheduling concerns and a range of other job quality issues. So workers are recruited through Facebook ads, they fill out surveys on the Qualtrics platform, and then weighting procedures are applied, drawing on different national government data sources to achieve greater representativeness. So in a wave of the SHIFT survey that was fielded in the spring of 2018, we added questions on current and previous experiences of workplace sexual harassment. And then we then used some existing Likert scale measures that were already in the SHIFT survey as our outcomes and moderators. Danny conducted analysis on the impacts of harassment. Phoebe did the analysis looking at supervisory fairness and coworker support as moderators. There were around 8,000 workers altogether in the sample, and they ran models that included a battery of demographic and employment-related controls, and those are the results that I'm going to speak about. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So for our purposes, I'm only going to speak about the results at a very high level, and then share with you the substance of what we found. We'll have a paper where you can take a look at the analysis in more detail before too long. So in line with previous research, our analysis showed that experiences of sexual harassment are impactful. Those who were harassed in their current job had lower job satisfaction and higher turnover intent. And people who were harassed in either their current or their past job reported lower sleep quality and higher psychological distress. One upshot here is that psychological impacts may be more durable in certain ways, but then we also can't capture how career consequences may compound over time in the way that Ariane, Eve, and Jess do in their research. So maybe people actually did leave a previous job because of harassment. Our survey results would not actually capture that. We also found that having good and supportive colleagues appears to mitigate these impacts, at least for some people. So those saying that they had fair supervisors were less likely to say that they wanted to leave their jobs due to harassment or to report poor sleep quality or psychological distress. And people reporting generally supportive coworkers were less likely to say that they wanted to leave their jobs or to report low job satisfaction because of harassment. Granted, there could be other unmeasured organizational dynamics that also help to account for these patterns in some way. Still, we think these results are pretty striking, if not totally surprising. It's helpful to see in this really broad national data set how positive workplace connections can often help to soften the blow of really negative and traumatic experiences in the world of work. Of course, there's an element of luck and good fortune in whether one happens to have good supervisors and coworkers, but for people who are interested in confronting sexual harassment systematically, there are obvious questions of institutional design. How do we create systems and foster workplace cultures that establish treating people with respect and supporting people who haven't been treated with respect as both a requirement and a norm? Vicki Schultz has written eloquently about how unconstrained subjective authority within organizations makes sexual harassment more likely. Changing those kinds of structures can help to shift supervisory behavior. And now Casey and Zoe are going to speak about a model for institutionalizing greater peer support in confronting workplace sexual harassment and violence. So I'm going to hand it back to Chandra to introduce Casey. Or just hand it directly to Casey, whatever works.
Sorry, trying to unmute over here. Yes, so we can now go ahead and have the presentation from Casey, which is the second piece of this.
Thank you, Chandra, Ariana, and Eve. Thanks so much for the coordination. To my fellow panelists, your work is inspiring and resonating with a lot of what we have done, and it's just great to be part of this virtual community. I want to transition into the janitorial promotora model, an approach for confronting workplace sexual violence in the low-paid service economy. And so that would be the next slide. And I want to just frame it in three ways and then turn it over to Zoe. The janitor's promotora model is a program to support institutionalizing peer support, so centering worker voice. The peer education model is an approach for confronting workplace sexual harassment and violence, building on traditions from community health and popular education. And finally, janitor promotoras face all these struggles and demonstrate the power of change strategies informed by those impacted and affected groups in ways that once again center the power of worker voice and contribute to transformational models. And so I'd like to turn it over to Zoe to continue with some of the methodology and results of our report.
Great. Thank you, Casey. So we're speaking about research that was published in a report called Sweeping Change, which we can share the link maybe afterwards in the chat. But as a bit of background to the research, the Janitors Promotora program or peer education program that Casey just spoke about is part of a comprehensive response to workplace sexual harassment and violence in California's janitorial industry. And this has been spearheaded by SEIU, USWW, as well as the Maintenance Cooperation Trust Fund, MCTF, and other allies. So just to introduce these players, SEIU, USWW is the janitors union, and it's the same local that created the renowned Justice for Janitors campaign, which was a successful drive to unionize a largely immigrant workforce that relied very heavily on social movement tactics. Sorry, next slide, I forgot to say that. Oops, okay. Yes, thank you. And the other key player in this is MCTF, which was created as a sort of watchdog organization for the non-union side of the janitorial industry in California. And so once these organizations recognized that sexual violence was actually a very serious and widespread issue in the janitorial industry, they came together with allies, including anti-violence organizations, to create the Ya Basta Coalition. And so through this collaboration, they've developed a sort of multi-pronged approach to confronting sexual violence in the industry, one that would reach both union and non-union workers. And this includes the creation of the Promotora or peer education program that we'll be discussing today, as well as addressing the issue through union contracts and through legislative campaigns. So the Promotora model really, and what we're talking about today, is really extending this kind of long-standing struggle for justice that janitors in California have been engaged in, and this time tackling an issue that often, as we know, remains hidden from view. Next slide, please. So the research questions that we were examining in our research, the first one being just to understand better the impact of sexual harassment and violence on janitorial workers in California. And here we're building on research done by colleagues, for example, at Berkeley LOHP and other work that has pointed to the severity of the problem in the industry and also described factors that give rise to these abusive conditions. So factors such as having a marginalized and largely immigrant workforce, increasingly subcontracted work in the industry, and the fact that janitors also work in isolated conditions usually. So it's really a key example of the ways that power inequities operate in low-wage industries in ways that enable exploitation and different forms of abuse, including sexual violence. So building on this work, we were looking at workers' experiences of workplace sexual harassment and violence, including who the perpetrators were, how it affected job security, and gendered impacts. We also wanted to understand what factors hindered or facilitated workers' comfort and their willingness to report this issue. So we looked at how supervisors, peers, and others shaped the workplace climate and how that influenced survivors' willingness to speak out. And then finally, we wanted to more deeply understand how this Promotora model supported survivor and worker leadership on the issue. Next slide, please. So to carry out the research, we incorporated elements of community-based participatory research, seeing research as a tool for communities to understand and change their own conditions of inequity and oppression, and for those who are affected, as Casey said, to be directly involved in both the research and the solution. And this was, we both felt an ethical imperative, but also really allowed the research to be more effective, to have workers directly involved in designing the survey questions, as well as 40 worker leaders and staff from the organizations were trained to be survey facilitators and received IRB certification to be investigators on the project. So this was a really key component in reaching a population of workers that where the silence surrounding the issue has often been an issue. And our research included a survey of janitors in California that reached more than 700 workers, a smaller survey that was focused on the experience of promotores and compadres, who are the male counterpoints, who are men janitors who want to support work on confronting this issue. And we did focus groups with 35 janitorial workers and in-depth interviews with 4 workers. Next slide, please. So as everyone has said, I'm going to kind of fly through this so we can save time for discussion. But so our research showed, unsurprisingly, the highly gendered impacts of workplace sexual harassment. So women janitors experiencing it at much higher rates than men. Also, the experience of gender nonconforming janitors. This was a small sample in our survey, but very high rates of sexual harassment and violence. And so we believe that warrants a closer look. And also we saw differences in how sexual harassment affected people's careers. So many women, but no men, had to change jobs within the industry as a result of the harassment or violence they experienced. And as well as related gender differences in underlying power dynamics. So women who experienced harassment were much more likely than men to be targeted by supervisors, which we saw as significant because this means that they're being targeted by people who have power and authority over their work, over their pay, et cetera. And in these cases, gender often intersected with things like immigration status, economic insecurity, and industry structure to make these women even more highly vulnerable to retaliation. Next slide, please. So one of the things that was really came through very strongly in our research also was that the janitors really described an environment of fear and silence around the issue of workplace sexual violence. And they described silence being enforced through various conditions, through employer retaliation, which has already been described by a number of colleagues, or employer inaction, as well as widespread stigma and victim blaming, which was coming from both supervisors as well as coworkers. And here retaliation could include being fired or threats of deportation, both of which are really heavily exploiting a workforce that's largely immigrant and also often very heavily saddled with chronic economic insecurity and therefore not able to afford losing a job. And so workers also described how the broader power dynamics of the workplace created real barriers to speaking out. And they described a kind of toxic workplace culture that either tacitly enabled this, the harassment, or actively was fostered by people in positions of power. And so, next slide, please. And so an issue that really emerged was the issue of trust and leadership. So the women janitors who had experienced sexual harassment and violence were significantly less comfortable speaking about it with supervisors and company HR reps than they were speaking about it with trained peers or advocates. And so the promotora model shows us that building worker leadership on the issue and cultivating relationships of trust can be a really key aspect of breaking that silence and shifting workplace practices and culture. Last slide, please. So just to wrap it up here, so the janitors promotora model is women janitorial workers are being trained to provide peer-to-peer education to their coworkers, informing them about their rights, supporting them in feeling empowered to report sexual harassment, and connecting them to resources, as well as providing trainings on responding to sexual harassment, preventing sexual harassment, and self-defense. Importantly, the model is very rooted in a healing-centered and trauma-informed approach. And this both entails taking the promotoras through a healing process for themselves, as many of them are survivors, as well as teaching them how to have a trauma-informed approach with their colleagues. And so we found that integrating this healing-centered, trauma-informed approach with collective empowerment and collective action was a really critical combination in enabling worker survivors to be able to take leadership on this issue. And so this was part of a broader multi-pronged coalition approach of connecting healing with broader strategies for systemic change, which also included legislation that has further institutionalized the role of peer educators. And we can speak about this more in the Q&A, but there's now legislation in California that requires in-person sexual harassment training, and now requires that to be done by peer trainers who have gone through specific programs. So the union has created an 80-hour maestria program that trains peer educators to be able to do that level of training. So I'm going to leave it there. I think that kind of connects to what Sanjay was describing about the role of peers and supervisors, and what does it look like to institutionalize a more stronger approach for supportive peers and supervisors. So I'll leave it there so we have time for Q&A.
All right, thank you very much. That was very interesting. But now we will turn over to Q&A. And I know that Jennifer has actually responded to a couple of the questions that were in the chat, but I did want to give her a chance if she wanted to expand on that a little bit. And if not, that's perfectly fine. I just wanted to give her the opportunity.
Sure, I can do that. So I think the two questions that people had raised to me, one was about if we had gotten information about whether individuals reaching out to us were in unions. That isn't one of the things that we ask people in this form that they fill out when they're requesting legal help. So it wasn't something that we tracked, but sometimes people will give us information that we haven't specifically asked about. They'll volunteer that, and that does come up. So I think that's an interesting question and something that maybe we should consider looking at in the future. It definitely fits with, advocacy priorities that we have at the National Women's Law Center, sort of supporting unionized workers. And it has come up in interesting ways with cases that we have funded and things like that. And then there was a question for me too about whether we have engaged with the EEOC. So maybe other folks in the audience have had this experience too. We have had people at the EEOC reach out to us to have sort of informal sessions with us and get our input about how they should make things better. And I think one of the reasons they did that is because they know that we're in touch with lawyers across the country who are filing EEOC charges on behalf of their clients. So we end up hearing, having a pretty nationwide perspective on how things are going and how it compares in different parts of the country and how it might have compared in different administrations and things like that. So we had given them feedback. I don't know if they have incorporated it. And, like I said, we end up sort of hearing about how things are going. So I have some impressions about how things are sort of changing over time, but we haven't done anything more formal with the EEOC than that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, Jessica and Eve, could you speak a little bit more about the consequential costs that you saw in the case studies, and then talk a little about maybe the future research on those kinds of costs, what that could explore?
Sure. I can take the first part of that question, Eve, if you want to do the second part of it. So just to give a little bit of more context on some of the knock-on or consequential costs we saw, there were two that, a lot of the consequential costs were not being able to pay bills and racking up late fees, etc. One particular example that was really striking for me, I think, was one of the cases, or one of the individuals that we interviewed. She was a food service worker who had her hours cut week after week after week after she had reported an incidence of sexual harassment, I think from a manager or somebody who was overseeing her. And she, at the time, because of the reduction in her wages, was not able to pay her rent on time for the apartment that she shared with her mother. And so she ended up accruing, I think, a little more than maybe $3,000 in late fees on her rent, which I feel like it doesn't sound like that much compared to the 1.3 million that we talked about, but when you already don't have money to pay for things, $3,000 is a lot. It's a pretty substantial additional fee to pay on top of your rent that you can't make. And what ended up happening for her is that she and her mother were evicted eventually, and she had to stay at friends' places for a little while she tried to, sort her circumstances out. And this really had a negative impact on her relationship with her mother too, which is not exactly a consequential cost, but was something that it was very clear that it was like a very it was very emotional for her that this was really negatively impacting her relationship with her mother. And it just goes to show that sort of the there are like the direct costs that affect you if you lose your job, etc. Like, harassment happens, you speak up, maybe you get reprimanded or whatever, like that's the direct cost, but then that ends up having sort of these second and third order effects, rippling throughout your life. Another example that I really love to highlight that I think might sort of like give another example is someone else that we spoke to. She had purchased a car while she was working and still owed about maybe like $5,000 on her car loan when she lost her job after she reported her sexual harassment. And because she lost that income, she stopped being able to, she was like unable to make payments on that loan. And so the loan company ended up taking her to court, repossessed her car, and she then also was not able to like drive herself to places to get new jobs or to do new work. So that sort of speaks to the like transportation insecurity that Eve was mentioning. So yeah, so in general, I feel like the consequential costs, like we mentioned, were really important for people who didn't have resources to fall back on. And really what it did was heighten their existing economic insecurity in ways that were really, really tangible, and that also affected their ability to like bounce back, I guess, from the negative impact.
Yeah, definitely. And we also wanted to talk about the connection between experiencing gender violence in the workplace and domestic violence at home. And this was something that we weren't able to look into. It was beyond the scope of our work, but I think a really great thing to look into for future work, because we do know through existing bodies of research that losing your job or taking a big reduction in income or being in a period of economic instability is a risk factor, is correlated with higher incidence of domestic violence. And we also know that it's harder to leave a situation of domestic violence if you've lost your job as well and you don't have the financial resources to do that. So I think there's a lot that we could look into even more in terms of those consequential costs.
Okay. Thank you, both Jess and Eve. Let's see. Okay, and here's a question from the comments. And I would love to see legislation to hold employers obligated to pay lost wage potential and these expenses incurred. Any possibility for that? Surely their insurance should cover that. And I think that question can go to anyone. It's not targeted to anyone in particular.
I can speak a little bit to that just through the expert interviews part of our research. We know that there's plenty of precedent for getting back lost wages. If you were fired, you could get reimbursed up to the time that you're making the complaint. But there was no precedent for lifetime costs. And then we also know that there are these cost caps on what you can get in response to a lawsuit. So in terms of like the emotional cost, which we know is, for one thing, impossible to really calculate as a number, but has these really serious and tangible effects, the cap is $300,000. So there are definite limitations, and I think the lifetime cost is one of those, and so is the cost for like emotional suffering.
I'd also like to add to Eve's response, which is really, really great. The additional component that I think even when you have legislation, the burden sort of falls on the person who experienced the harassment to like prove that they were wrongly, fired, or that harassment occurred. It wasn't, due to something else. And so legislation can help to an extent, but particularly for some of the people that we spoke to who didn't seek legal redress for their experiences, part of it is just that it's, it can be costly, which thankfully the Times of Legal Defense Fund, that's part of, why they're set up to, what they're set up to do is to help with some of the costs and putting people in contact with lawyers. But I think especially if you're one of the people who lose your job and you think that the employer is at fault, but you're dealing with like, I can't pay my rent, I can't pay my car, like that's your immediate concern. And you might struggle with, being able to prioritize like filing a lawsuit against your employer to get those costs back. Your priority may be to like try to, just continue to like float, like to tread water until you can kind of get to somewhere where you can breathe a little bit better. And so I think that that's another, when we're talking about legislation, it's not just about, making sure that it's not just about getting employers to cover this cost, but it's also about making sure that the burden of making sure that happens does not fall on the person who is experiencing the hardship themselves. And that's a little bit trickier, and I think is a bit of a different set of policies to address that. Yeah.
All right, we have okay, we have just a few minutes left. I think we have time for one more question. And this looks like it's going to Casey and Zoe. In addition to the promotorial model, do you feel that legislation similar to the 2017 Chicago hands-off pants on ordinance, which helps protect hospitality industry employees, could be beneficial for janitors?
I think that's a really important question. And I think the collective bargaining agreement that talked about a panic button and training and postings in every hotel room for that the hospitality workers lifted up and innovated was brilliant. And I'm going to ask Zoe to talk a little bit about the legislation that went hand in glove with the Yabasta initiative, because it requires subcontractors to hire trained promotoras to deliver training to their workforces as part of a legislative obligation that was passed. So I'm going to turn it back to Zoe.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there's a lot of similarities also in that, minus the actual panic button, which that would be interesting to know if janitors would find that a useful solution. But I think they're kind of dispersed through a lot of different office buildings. So it's a little bit of a different infrastructure physically, but you had a similar situation where they surveyed workers like in Chicago to kind of come up with realizing that this was a really big issue, similarly to in California, and then having a legislative solution that also tries to address some of the root issues that make workers more vulnerable to this. And so I think because there was also protections against retaliation, and I think in Seattle they also had an ordinance that had, I think, even more protections for hotel workers than the Chicago one. And so in California, the legislation that the Yabasta Coalition advocated for and successfully passed, the first set of legislation was mandated in-person sexual harassment training for workers and supervisors. But it also addressed some of the issues of like requiring businesses to register and tying licensing to consequences for sexual harassment and violations. So creating like greater consequences for this and trying to make it easier to track companies that would sort of like disappear overnight if they got cited for violations. But then the second legislation that they passed was, as Casey just said, mandated that the in-person training be done by peer educators, and that those peer educators be using a curriculum that was it's a curriculum that was created by like LOHP in collaboration with the promotoras. So that's Berkeley LOHP. And so the union has created this Ya Basta Center, which trains janitors in this 80-hour training program to become professional peer educators, or however you want to phrase it, who then are actually hired to perform these mandated trainings, which actually that's going to start this summer. The pandemic delayed the start of those peer trainings because they really wanted it to be in person. So there's similarities in that there was like also addressing both the unionized portion of the workforce as well as the union portion of the workforce through things that are mandated through the union contract, as well as having this like legislative component that tries to sort of address some of the holes and protections.
Okay. It looks like we are over time. I do want to point out to everyone that Eve has put a couple of the papers in the chat if you want to download them. I definitely want to thank all of my panelists. These were some really good presentations, really good information. I want to thank the audience, and I want to thank Lyra for having us. And so I want to thank you all and enjoy the rest of the conference. Am I forgetting anything? All right, enjoy the rest of the
Thank
conference.
you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, Chandra.
Thanks, Chandra.
Yeah.
Bye,
Thank you.
co-panelists. Bye, audience. Whoops.
And can we stop the recording now?